There's a pivotal moment in the drama between Yosef and his brothers where Yosef's emotions literally boil over. The Rebbe will masterfully pick apart Rashi's interpretation of the story to illustrate to us exactly what happened and how we know that's what happened. So Pasuk says, "Vaymaher Moshe Yosef rushed ki nichmeru rachma vel achiv," because his compassion for his brother, his mercy for his brother boiled over, brother being Binyamin. Stellt sich Rashi in zweiten Dibur vom Wort nichmeru. So Rashi has two comments on this. We're going to look at the second one first. We will come back to the first. And he says that word nichmeru needs an explanation. And his Mefarish gives us three elements that help to explain this word. Firstly, he says it means nischamamu, that he heated up. And then he says, V'lashain Mishnah, it's like the expression that you see in the Mishnah, which says, Ala kuma shel zeisim, when you pack together olives in order for them to warm up. Then he says, V'lashain Arami, in Aramaic, in other words, in the Gemara, you're going to see Mishum Michmar Bisra, the concept of heating meat. Over Mikra, and then he brings a pasuk from Eicha, which says, Ereinu kesanun ichmaru, our skin heated up like an oven. V'nikmetu, says Rashi, that means that nischamu v'nikmetu kimotim means that they heated up and wrinkled up. Mipnei, going back to the pasuk, because of the fever associated with famine. Says Rashi, that's the nature of anything that is made out of skin. When it heats up, it contracts and it wrinkles. Okay, we understand why Rashi has to explain the word, because we don't know the word. The fact that Rashi has to support his translation that nichmeru means to heat up, that's understood. As nichmeru meint nischamu is verstandig. That's self-understood. Because he has to ben chomish lemikra, the child who's now learning chomish for the first time, will now encounter this unusual word nichmeru for the first time in the Torah. So it makes sense. If we're going to explain the word, we have to explain how we know this is the explanation. However, we have 8 other questions about how Rashi has presented and what Rashi has said about this word nichmeru. First of all, what should strike us immediately? Aleph, why does Rashi need 3 different explanations to prove the meaning of the word, from a Mishnah, from the Gemara, and from a pasuk? Because it's self-evident, and we feel molgeret, something we've discussed numerous times. Mehrere Rayas bringen gebracht durch jeder von sei Phasich ist nicht genügend in die andere und die andere ergänzt das. So there's got to be something that's lacking in each of the proofs, and that's why he brings more. So that raises the question, why is each of the proofs that Rashi brings that the word nichmeru means to heat insufficient on its own and relies on the others? That's question 1. Question 2, what a strange order to present these proofs. Based the Seder von the Rayas and Pirush Rashi. First he quotes from a Mishnah. And then Aramaic, which is the Gemara. And the last proof that he brings is from a pasuk. That makes no sense. You would expect that the first proof you always bring is from Torah language. And especially when you consider what it says over there in the pasuk and Eicha, it's got an advantage over the other two. It's got the exact same word as in our pasuk, as opposed to the Mishnah and Gemara, which have variations of the word. Now, if the pasuk doesn't give you everything you need to know, the next step would be obnoitik, if necessary, derived from the Shein Mishnah. You bring the Mishnah, which has a high authority, and your last port of call would be the Gemara, which is Aramaic. Why does it put it in such a strange order? Now, if you are going to quote a Mishnah, why is this the Mishnah to select? Gimel. Why does Rashi bring the pile of olives, which is in Bava Metzia? Or need from Kemishal Novim, why doesn't he bring the example of a pile of grapes, same word, which he could have brought from an earlier source, Masechta Yavamis, which comes long before Bava Metzia? Why skip over a proof and find a later proof? And the truth is, we could ask the same question about the quote from Gemara, Daled. When he brings the Aramaic meaning of the word, which is supposed to help us, rather than speaking about heating meat, which is only brought in Gemara Psachim, he could have brought the expression that speaks about heating and cooking things, which is already brought in Gemara Brachos. Why 3 proofs? Why in this order? Why do you skip over earlier proofs in both the Mishnah and the Gemara? Now, when it comes to the proof from Eicha, well, there's a whole different question. Not only is it the question of there are other earlier proofs that he could have brought, but there's another question to think about too. Nochmer. It's nicht moving in dem Lashon Mikra, was Rashi bringt a pasuk in Eicha. So, firstly, the same question about skipping over earlier proofs. Why quote from Eicha? If the word nichmaru in that form already appears in two earlier books of Tanakh, Hosea and Melachim. Melachim is even earlier. Das nicht nur sein sie frei und seid am Kreuz von Tanakh. Not only are those two references that are earlier, in other words, you'll encounter them first in Tanakh. But as I said, the question gets bigger. They're actually more suitable, surely, to be brought as a proof. Why? Because of the context in which they are presented. Our pasuk is talking about emotions that boil over, and the psukim in Melachim and Hosea also speak about boiling emotions. So boiling over mercy and compassion, which is very suited to our pasuk in Melachim. Or the comfort that Eibishter says is going to boil over to the Yidden is still talking about emotion. So surely, Kumen and Shaychat Sahegash Alei, seeing as they both relate to emotion, that's Punkt v'nichmer rachmav in unser parsha. Isn't that exactly the same theme and message as our parsha? Best place to look for a proof. Whereas, when we speak about our skin boiling in Eicha, it's talking about skin. And nothing at all to do with emotions. Why would Rashi bring that to prove that the word nichmru here means that your emotions, or Yosef's emotions, boiled over? Also, the way Rashi brings that proof from Eicha is very odd. He brings half the pasuk, then he interrupts it, and then he brings the other half of pasuk. So Vav, bringing diktiraya von Ereinu Kasanon Ichmaru, when Rashi quotes that pasuk, is Rashi matik dem weiter digen hemshach von pasuk. We know that Rashi doesn't only say what happened, but he also says the second half of the pasuk why it happened, because of the fever that people had because of hunger. Now, we have to understand, who needs that? We don't need to know why in Eicha the skin boiled. We just need to know that Nichmru means it boiled. What the story was? Find that out when you learn Eicha. By the other eyes from the Shei Mishnah and Aram, as Rashi bringt nicht dem weiteren Hemshach Duber vehoinyan. Look, when Rashi quotes the Mishnah, he doesn't give us the context. When he quotes the Gemara language, he doesn't give us the context. So why here? Why here do we have to know that it's because of the fever associated with hunger? And sei noch schwerer zu verstehen den Bier von Rashi beim Ausfer von Pirish. And then, why is Rashi getting into so much detail, explaining to us how skin wrinkles when it's heated? What's it got to do with our conversation? That skin wrinkles up when it's hot. Okay, we're talking about when somebody's emotions get hot and the person's emotions literally overflow. What's it got to do with skin that crinkles up? And lastly, be'eches of a choleifen hat das kein wenn iskavs gedarf stehen gleich noch kemotim und nicht mafsig seine mitten Bier wegen von Pirish Rashi durch den Hemshach HaKosim he plays Zalaf Yisrael. And then why does Rashi split this up? First, he quotes the pasuk that says Oireina kesanon ichmaru, which means that the skin boiled up like an oven. Then he pauses and says, which is what happens with skin when it gets really hot. And then he continues with the quotation of the pasuk, why it happened over there. That's really strange. So to understand all of that, we're going to go back to the first way that Rashi addresses the issue of Nichmeru, which is the preceding Rashi. All of this will make sense once we analyze what Rashi says on the previous commentary on this pasuk. So there he quotes of Tiverta, Ki Nichmeru Rachamov, that Yosef reacted because his emotions had overflowed. Says Rashi, Sha'oloi, Yosef asked Binyamin, Yesh lecha ach me'eim, do you have a maternal brother? Amrei ach hoyoli, he said, I had a brother, but I don't know where he is anymore. So Yosef says to him, Yesh lecha bonim, do you have sons? Amrei yesh li asor, he says, yes, I have 10 sons. Amrei, so Yosef says to him, Umashemam, what are their names? Amrei bech belo becher v'goyim, he gives the whole list of his sons' names. Yosef says to him, what's the nature of these names? Are they named after somebody? Does it represent something? Says Binyamin, all of their names are related to my brother, and the difficulty and distress that he went through. And then he explains them. Bela means he was swallowed up by the nations. Becha because he was the older brother, the firstborn to my mother. On Rashi is Mamshech ois zu teichen dem main von alle 10 Namen, and Rashi then goes through the details of all 10 names and what they represent. So gebendig zum Seif dem Mokka von seinem Pirish, and then noch concludes with where we get this from. Kitisim b'Masechta Soita, the Gemara Soita. On Firtois, and then Rashi concludes that miyad, immediately after hearing this narrative from Binyamin, nichmeru rachamov, that's when Yosef became so emotional. So there's such an obvious question over here. Why do you explain the whole story before you explain the word? Surely logically, first tell me what nichmeru means, and then tell me why nichmeru. Verwas ist Rashi makdim in ersten Dibur aufzuklären und varichas des Sibbe, was hat gebracht zu nichmeru. Why does Rashi first address in such detail the cause of why his emotions suddenly went so hot? Why does he do that before he even tells us what nichmeru means? The logical order of how Rashi should have addressed this pasuk would have been the exact opposite order. Zum ersten ist nötig zu wissen, was ist da geschehen. First, we need to understand what happened. What does nichmeru mean? Was meint Wort nichmeru? Und erst danach ist matem zu reden wegen der Sibbe von der Geschehnis, and then it makes sense to say, and why. So what is nichmeru, and why? Why does he flip the order around? And then there are a couple other questions we have to ask as well. Eichin is kasha. Now the question. Aleph, was ist das Schwernpisch akasav al pipshat? Al pipshuto shal mikra. When I read the pasuk in its simple understanding, what am I missing? What don't I understand? What's difficult to understand? That Rashi has to address by telling us the whole story about the conversation between Binyamin and Yosef and the names. It's a beautiful story. But what was I missing in the pshat that I need the story? The story at face value is a very simple story, easy to understand. Yosef, after many years, have not seen his brother Binyamin, his full brother. Sein einziger Bruder me'imoi, the only one who shares the same mother as him. And the one he has no resentment against because he wasn't involved in selling him. Obviously, that caused him to be very emotional. Why does Rashi have to explain anything further? And Film is all non-nehmen als Rashi hat gewissen Herrecht zusammen damit dieser vollkommenen Massenmatten von Rei zwischen Yosef and Binyamin. Okay, let's assume that Rashi finds some compelling reason in the pasuk that we need to know that there was a deep, meaningful conversation between Yosef and Binyamin. Wie Chazal erzählen, the conversation the Gemara describes. It's okay. Wollt gewähnt genug, herabzubringen bloß die Ascholem von Zippor. All Rashi had to do was give the intro to the story, the part where he says, did you have a brother? And then he could have told us where the story is discussed, and we could go do homework and we could read the rest of the story. Why are all of these, or what do all of these details add? Especially that Rashi goes and interprets every one of the 10 names in Avonas HaPshat from Pasuk. What does that add to our understanding of the simple meaning of the pasuk? Or to put it differently, in under a verte, where in the story, as we read it in the psukim, do we have any of this information about a conversation, what the conversation was about, that there were sons? And that's what Rashi is explaining, but where's he explaining it from? And another question. Why are Binyamin's sons even entering the picture at this point? How do Binyamin's sons get into this story? We're only going to hear about Binyamin's sons in the next parasha of Vayigash. How are they already here in this story? And last question, bit of a subtle question. Why does Rashi say immediately, as soon as he heard the story, that's when Yosef became so incredibly emotional? Why miyad? Where is the makref them? Where does Rashi see in the pasuk that this was the catalyst? This conversation switched Joseph around. But Bald Rashi is nit matik from pasuk in the words vayimahir, especially when you consider that Rashi, in his heading for this commentary, and his heading will always contain the words that are relevant to his interpretation. He doesn't include the word vayamaher, that there was a rush, that there was some kind of pressure, urgency. So in order to understand all of this, we've got to understand where Yosef is coming from. Try and get into the head of Yosef at this particular point in time, and then things start to make sense. The Birindem explanation is this. We cannot explain this as we would want to if we were just looking at it superficially. We'd say, it's a reunion. Obviously, he's emotional. Don't say that. As the sibu von nichmur rachma vaybakesh lifkois, that the reason he had this overwhelming emotion and ran off to cry is given dos as Yosef had the zem Binyamin, and is because now he sees Binyamin for the first time in decades. Because if that is the case, this is not the pasuk where he sees Binyamin. At the beginning of this whole section, that's when Binyamin arrives. Yosef sees Binyamin. That's where he should have become so emotional. But he doesn't. Especially considering that here at this point, it's suddenly that there's this urgency, there's this swelling up of emotions. What? He saw Binyamin before. So it can't be that just simply the reunion with Binyamin sets him off. But I'll call upon him, if it wasn't going to be mentioned at the beginning when Binyamin arrives for the first time, at least surely when the Torah tells us, when the Shvatim came to his house, and Yosef sees Binyamin, and there the Torah tells us, his mother's son, which is right here, at this point, where they're all gathering in his house. No emotion there either. So what's happened? He doesn't blow up emotionally when he sees Binyamin. He doesn't get all emotional when Binyamin walks over the threshold of his door. So what sets him off? Seeing as the Torah tells us, even after the second time he sees Binyamin, now in his own house, he first questions the brothers, is this him? And then he gives him a bracha, that they should show you chen. And only after that occurs, that's when we suddenly see this eruption of emotion. Is this a bavais that shows us as that it wasn't the sight of Binyamin that was so compelling for him or so arousing for him and made him cry. There's something else. Now, there's a really good reason why seeing Binyamin would not elicit this tremendous emotion from Yosef, because let's get into Yosef's head. And the time davon is moving muchach in Pashtus, it's quite self-evident. Yosef zayin de kamishla melech hazoi viel Zeit. Yosef has now spent 2 decades as the ruler of Egypt, or years and years as the ruler of Egypt, right? To the extent that nobody else has any authority to do anything without his permission. And the only superior to him is Paroi himself. There's no question about it that over time, Yosef would have adopted an attitude and a behavior that was very strong and very firm. Especially especially in the presence of his brothers, where he's playing a role that he's showing himself to be such a harsh leader. So even when he sees Binyamin now walk through the door, there's no question it was emotional for him internally. But it's equally clear as that until Yosef is ready to reveal his identity to his brothers, in the Unwesenheit von Arumika mention, and especially if there are other people, the Egyptians around, at Yosef als Mishneh Lamelech, Yosef with the full self-control of an appropriate viceroy, he controlled his emotions and didn't allow anything to show on the outside. Is as you actually see from our part of the story, that even when it reached the point that he needed to cry, he goes away from the crowd to cry in private. Und der Farge findet man taken nicht in der ganze Sedre. That's why you won't find in this entire section as Yosef soll ausdrücken offen at nur von Isachus v'chulei, that Yosef does not show any public display of emotion, especially not something as vulnerable as crying. Even though all the interactions that he had with the brothers had many evocative moments, and they certainly stimulated emotion. Hearing about his father's pain at having lost Yosef, etc. But that was Yosef's self-discipline. He has a cover to uphold. He is the Mishneh Lamelech. He doesn't break down. So it makes sense that he doesn't show emotion until now. The question is, what's now? What happens now? What changes now? So therefore we have to conclude, following the train and the implications of the words of the Pesukim, that after he sees Binyamin, and then something happens, he gives him a bracha, that Eibishter should show him chen, is vorgekommen an Indien, was sein Wirken ist gewinn noch starker von der Pule von Vayaris Binyamin. Something must have happened in between seeing Binyamin and blessing Binyamin that shifted Yosef in a way that even just seeing his brother hadn't done. Bald as the Pasuk is nicht mehr forsch, was das ist gewinn. Seeing as the Torah doesn't tell us what that event was, the Torah only alludes to the fact that there was a catalyst, a watershed moment. We'll have to assume that whatever this unique event was that shifted Yosef so dramatically must be linked to and somehow a result of the bracha that he gives to Binyamin. Brachas was Binyamin out from the Eibishter and was haben a shaykhs zu vermelech a working of Yosef. These are brachas from the Eibishter because lekim yachnecha. It's a bracha from Hashem to Binyamin via Yosef. That is a critical moment in the story. But Frat, I've seen shaykhs to Binyamin and als achiv. And especially, it's got to be whatever the relationship, whatever's happening over here, must be related to the fact that Yosef and Binyamin are full brothers. Because the Torah is telling us the emotion that boiled over was directed to his brother, to Binyamin. So the fact that it's his brother is critical to the story. So what happened? We don't find it in the Pasuk, so where you're going to have to look? In Drash. Therefore, Rashi has to fill us in on all of that information because we need the full information to understand what's going on over here. It's a dramatic departure from Yosef's behavior up until this point in time. So he tells us everything starting from Yosef saying to Binyamin, do you have a brother from the same mother? As the Pasuk already alludes to the fact that he was his brother from his mother. That's who Yosef saw, the brother from his mother. But not only is he having a conversation about the fact that we're brothers, which, well, he hasn't said that yet, but he's alluding to it, but somehow it must link to Binyamin's children. How do you know that? Because of that word, Chanan. Because this story is linked to the bracha that Yosef gives to Binyamin, that the Eibishter should show you chen, that's similar to Yaakov's response to Esav. These are the children that the Eibishter gave me with chen. That's what Yaakov received, right? Or Yaakov said. That's an expression that Yaakov used with regards to children. So therefore there's a link. Somehow what Yosef's talking about over here must be linked to Binyamin's children, but not just because they are children. Rashi says, I see what's going on over here. Yosef is connecting the brotherly connection to Binyamin, and then he's asking him about his children, which is alluded to in Elokim Yachnecha Beni, and then he's so emotional. It must be something about those children and their relationship to Yosef being Binyamin's brother. That's what must have woken this emotion in him. So was der Fahrrad es gebracht, darf nicht mehr Rachma vel achiv. It's something about that erupted this emotion. Der Fall sagt Rashi, zwischen Yosef und Binyamin ist vorgekommen Raid. Therefore Rashi borrows from the Gemara and tells us there was a conversation between Yosef and Binyamin. Was haben angehörte Achve gefühlen auf einen ungewöhnlichen Eufen, which brought that feeling of brotherhood between Yosef and Binyamin to an unprecedented level, bis das hat gemusst peil sein bei Yosefen, until it was so powerful that Yosef was compelled to respond, trotz die Tkifas Anhaga, in spite of all of his attempts to keep himself looking so in control. The meaning from Vayivakesh Livkois, here he's shattered and he has to cry. Und damit wird verstanden Kanal für was Rashi darf bringen die ganze Arichas Hadvarim. That explains why Rashi has to give us so much information. Von Sholei v'chulei, Amalei v'chulei, he asked him about it. Does he have a brother? He asked him about his children. Und dem Oisteich von jedem Namen Basunder, and Rashi has to tell us what every single name means. Weil Yochnecho Stam in Ganzen, because this concept of giving the Schein, the special bracha to Binyamin, mit alle seine Protim kol sal sibu von Nichmer Rachamav, is a result of the fact that Yosef is so emotional at this point in time. Yeah, the Prat is again the Marois bringen die umgewöhnliche Ach von Gefühl von Binyamin zu Yosef. So every detail of every one of Binyamin's children and what they represent is a detail of what stimulates this immense emotional response from Yosef. As agam Binyamin is best mechiras Yosef blois alt given berch 19 years. Look at it in context. Binyamin at the time that Yosef was sold was a child, 9, maybe 10 years old. Hatte doch bemeshach die alle Jahre nicht aufgehört zu trachten von Achi ben Ima Yosef und seine Zores. And here Yosef discovers, not only has Binyamin not forgotten him, but he's consistently thought about him and his travails. And how deeply has he thought about it? Bis zum Äußeren sein Zaren Azayin wie die Namen von seinen Kinder. It's so deeply personal to him that he's illustrated his feelings in the names given to his own children. Und noch mehr, in den Namen von alle 10 Kinder und bei jedem Namen mit der Basunderteichen von Gaguim. Not only one child as the token commemoration of his brother, every one of his 10 children, and each one representing a different concept of his yearning, tsar v'chadoima, or his pain. Al Shem Achi v'Hatzoris Hashem Mitzau, as Rashi tells us. I've named them after my brother and his travails. Azoi, as B'shasefet Demonim welche Kinder soll nicht sein, to the extent, so what's Binyamin created? A reality where whenever he thinks of any one of his children, it reminds him of his brother, his lost brother. That has a huge impact on Yosef. Und dafür noch der Mann kann man verstehen. Only with that information can we appreciate was hat Yosef nicht mehr gekannt einhalten sein Tkifus, why Yosef could no longer control himself. Und wer Rashi führt euch so mit that's what Rashi says specifically, miyad nichmeru rachamav. There is no room for self-control anymore. Miyad, immediately it has an impact on him and he has to go cry. Damit is echt mevurf was Rashi is meforish friro varichas de sibo fun nichmeru. Now it makes a tremendous amount of sense why Rashi first tells us the backstory. Eider fatayshim vort nichmeru gufa before he could actually explain what the word nichmeru means, because nichmeru will only make sense against that backdrop. Only once we understand the nature of the conversation between Yosef and Binyamin, then we can appreciate why nichmeru has to mean this heating up of emotion to boiling point. Because we know how the story is going to go. It's going to go to a point where Yosef has this unexpected burst of emotion. As mentioned, way deeper and more powerful than the response from the fact that he recognizes his long-lost brother Binyamin. Is made a movement as the Taich von Nichmeru is nischamamu. So now that I know what's going on and I understand the psychology and the response Yosef has had and what he's confronted, I get that Nichmeru must mean a real heating up of emotion. Heiserun starke hisrakshus. A very powerful, hot type of emotion. Und nicht wie der Targum Onkelos verteidigt Nichmeru is geidelu. Not like Onkelos says, a kind of general awakening of emotion, a gewöhnliche hiserus. That's Rashi's message. But Rashi's not satisfied just with telling us that's the story. Now you get how worked up he was. Rashi also wants to bring us proofs. Rashi is not satisfied. Warum hagam as fun mashmos aksuvim is moving as nichmeru rachmav, even though the pasuk does now imply that nichmeru means means more than just the regular awakening of emotion. It means a dramatic type of explosive emotion. Is noch davon als kein Reihe nicht, dass nichmeru tagt in sich bedafke dem Teich von nischamamu. Rashi still doesn't have clear evidence just from our context that the word nichmeru must mean heat. It could mean a lot of emotion, it could mean an arousal of emotion. How do I know it means heated, explosive emotion? Und nicht an anderen elchen Teich. How do I know it doesn't mean something else, similar, an awakening? The Rebbe bringt Rashi a raya auf ein Teich von einem Wort, so therefore the first thing Rashi has to do is find us a source that explains the meaning of the word, just the word on itself. Leidem ist verstandig bepashas was Rashi bringt nicht kein raya von Nichmer Rachmea in Melochim. Now we understand why Rashi is not going to bring another example in Tanakh, which also talks about emotions, whether it's the one in Melochim, or von Nichmer Nechomai and Yehoshea. Dafka v'aloich dodin retzich wegen regesh halev. It's actually because those are talking about emotional outbursts, as over in unser pasuk, as our parasha is, so then they don't help us understand the unique translation of our pasuk. Is von dort nicht talking Raimochachas ken klara bavais. Neither of those sources will show us clearly as der nichmeru do meint nischamamu, that this usage of the word nichmeru actually means this explosive emotion. I don't know. Maybe it's emotion here, like it's emotion there. A lot of compassion, a lot of consolation. Even if the context there implies that there's a tremendous amount of emotion, but there's nothing there that indicates that the translation of the word nichmeru is more compelling than it is here. Especially when you look at Unclus. Unclus there translates nichmeru as an arousal of emotion, as he does here. So Rashi can't use that as his primary proof because he doesn't want to talk about an arousal of emotion. He wants to talk about an explosion of emotion. Therefore, Rashi has to find the word nichmeru in a different context where I could see objectively that it means heat. Somewhere where the word has to mean heating up. So therefore, the Asharai brings the from Lashon Mishnah. First, he quotes from the Mishnah. Why? Was is Lashon HaKodesh al derech vi Lashon HaKsuvim? Because the benefit of Mishnah is that it's written in Lashon HaKodesh, which is similar to the language of Tanakh. Al HaKoimer shel zeisim. We're talking about this pile of olives. So kumar is actually the container in which you pile up the olives so that they generate this heat. Now I know that if that's the word we give to that appliance because of its heating properties, then I know that the root word, which is related to nichmeru, is a word of heating. First port of call. The only thing is, it's not necessarily a totally conclusive proof, because we cannot say we could still ask, how do I know that the word kumar actually means heating? I know the process is heating, but how do I know that the word means heating? How do I know that the name of this utensil is kumar because it's a heating utensil? Maybe that's just the generic name they give to it. Without any illustration of what it does. Therefore, Rashi brings another proof from the Gemara Bava Metzia, Michmar Bisra, the process of Psachim, from the Gemara Psachim, of Michmar Bisra, heating up the meat. There, we're not describing a utensil, we're describing a process. What is the process? Heating. I get it. So now I've got proof that the word kumar means heating. And Aramaic does often help us to understand Lashon HaKodesh, as typically the Gemara helps us understand the Mishnah. And the Mishnah itself is obviously going to use language that is similar to the language in Torah itself. Now coming from the Gemara, which gives us insight into the Mishnah, which in turn will help us understand the pasuk. I get it that the word kumar, nichmeru, etc. is all from the word to heat. I know now that in the Mishnah it is called a kumar because its purpose is to heat. Now, Rashi brings derived from the Shem Kumar, was steht in Friedrich in Shas. That also helps us to understand why he quotes the Gemara from Psachim and not the Gemara in Brochus. The Lashon Kumar shel Anovim Masechta Yevamis kommt behemshech zu dem was the Gemara sagt dort. So we said, why don't you look in the Gemara Yevamis, which came before Bava Metzia, and there you'll see the expression of this heating container of grapes. So there, the pasuk that the Gemara is discussing is as follows: the Yeshayim, when it talks about how the lips of those who sleep, which is euphemistic for people who have passed away, then the concept is that Talmidei Chacham, when you share their Torah, their lips move. So there the Gemara says, Kekumar shel hanovim. It's like this jam-packed container of these grapes, which are obviously meant to ferment. Just like in that context, if you then touch the grapes with your finger, they immediately start to agitate and the juice of the grapes comes out. Likewise, Talmidei Chachamim, you quote their Torah and their lips begin to move even when they're in the grave. So if that was the quotation, even if we had the support of the other expression that Michmar Bisra means the heating of meat, still is nitken starkerai from Kumashal Anovim as das meint l'shein chamimos. I wouldn't have any real clarity from that particular context with the pressed grapes that it actually means heat, because from the Technologien Gitanor zu sagen as die Keili ruft sich Kumar. Because there also I could still believe the container is called the kumar. And I wouldn't know that it's specifically because it heats. Not dem, was in der Krise in der Anoven gepresst, und Mele is dem Wein Teusus und rührt sich von der Anoven. Because the implication there actually is it's not heat that affects the grapes, it's compression, it's pressure that affects and agitates and ferments the grapes. So it's almost the opposite of what we'd want to prove. And therefore, what man gekannt annehmen as das ist die Mashmos von Kumar, I could actually come out of there thinking that Kumar means pressure or compression, not heat. So it wouldn't be useful to us. Even the quotation in Gemara Brachas that spoke about cooking kumra is same problem. I don't get from that the word kumar means the activation of heat. Maybe it's just describing a particular way that dates are packed. It's not clear in that context that even if there we could use kamra as an adjective of heat, we don't know that it could be used as a verb to represent the heating process. Maybe it's just only used as an adjective in a particular context. The bottom line is each of the other examples that Rashi we thought should have used from earlier places in the Gemara are not as solid as the proofs that he has brought. Now, verbald as the word do is nichmeru. The two examples from the Mishnah and the Gemara that Rashi has brought, even though they illustrate the meaning of the word, are not in the same form as it is here in our story. They're not nichmeru. Therefore, will Rashi So Rashi would like to now at least find the same construction of the word, ideally in a pasuk, to consolidate our understanding that nichmeru means to heat up. So therefore, that's why he quotes from Eicha. Eicha doesn't actually give a definition of the word in the context that we need it, but rather, now that we know the context, we can understand what that it could mean to heat up. And it's Dafka Rashi's opinion, because other opinions say that nichmeru means to be darkened. They were so famished that their skin actually went black. So we do know that there's an alternative possibility that we could say that there it means that because of famine their skin went dark, as others do. So therefore Rashi explains how I believe that in this pasuk nichmeru means heated. Why? Because look what the pasuk says, because it's talking about the fever associated with, not the hunger, the fever associated with famine. And mestakas rov compels an as the orzal nishchor veren. Yes, famine could cause a person's skin to darken. But the fact that the pasuk reiterates again later in the pasuk, firstly it tells us ketanor. That's a big indicator, like an oven. But then it adds again mit zalafos, mit fire and heiskite. The word zalafos, which is fever, heat. Is this for mechayev as nichmeru meint don ischamu? Well, then you must assume that the word nichmeru does not mean to darken the skin, but to heat the skin, and that fits neatly with everything that Rashi has told us about the word nichmeru, that it means to heat up. But if all we're saying is that the pasuk indicates a rise in temperature on the body because of the famine, verta shayla. So then we have to ask ourselves a question: what's the Navi saying that's so dramatic? Yes, it's a normal thing. A person who's not well, they haven't eaten, they're undernourished, they might catch a fever. What's the Navi, what's your Miyod telling us over there that's so dramatic? So Rashi says, what's dramatic? Rashi tells us, in Eicha, the word nichmeru does not only mean heat. Now, oich the main for nikmatu kimatim, it means the shriveling up of the body. As Rashi tells us, that the nature of skin is, when you heat it up, it wrinkles. When the Torah here, when Eicha tells us that their skin had heated, Rashi says, the Torah doesn't have to tell us what's so terrible about that. Imagine the scene. It's natural for a person whose skin is so hot, it's going to shrivel. You can understand how painful that experience must be. Rashi doesn't have to explain it. He's just reminding us what happens. And finally, like them is moving, we finally understand why Rashi quotes the proof from Tanakh last, because logically you would have expected it to be first. Even though it is the language of Torah. And it's the same word that we have in our parsha, which surely takes precedence. Because as Rashi has illustrated, in Eicha specifically, the word nichmeru does mean heated, but it also means shriveled. In fact, shriveled is the main thrust of what the pasuk is trying to illustrate to us. So therefore Rashi can't bring it as the first explanation, because it doesn't show exclusivity that the word nichmeru means heated, because it could also mean shriveled. And Rashi wants to know that in our context it means heated. That's what he's telling us, that Yosef literally exploded in emotion. Now let's take this whole explanation to a deeper level from the perspective of Chassidus. Chassidus explains that this moment where Yosef is so dramatically emotional and he can't contain himself anymore is actually a story of each of us. Yosef is sometimes used as a collective noun for the whole Jewish people, as the pasuk says in Tehillim. So every Jew in their status as Yosef has a requirement to arouse great compassion for he who is in the status of Binyamin, which is also known as Ben Oini, the son of affliction. What does that mean? Every one of us has to contemplate how much the neshama has had to descend and regress, to come down so low, and when we contemplate that, we have to, as Yosef had this tremendous compassion for Binyamin, we have to have this tremendous compassion, or the need to arouse compassion and mercy for our own neshama, for the godly spark within ourselves. Great lesson. And from the way Rashi describes the details of the story between Yosef and Binyamin are relevant to the details of the story of how we arouse this great mercy for our own neshama. And even not only the details that Rashi shares, but the order in which he shares them. Where Rashi first gives us the backstory of what happened between Yosef and Binyamin, and then uses that as a way of introducing the meaning of the word nichmeru, that it means to heat up. So the first step that a person has to do is to contemplate in achi v'hatzoros asher mitzauhu, to think about my brother, i.e. my neshama, and the difficulties it's been through. The first thing we have to contemplate is how great and beautiful and wonderful the neshama is. It's at the level of being a brother, and Achi means that it's in a constant state of connection to godliness. Once we appreciate the greatness of the neshama, then it makes sense to consider how much difficulty it's faced. Then you can think about the tzoros, these bonus in Yerida, how much it had to descend, to the extent that it got swallowed up in the nations, like Binyamin says about his son, and all the other details. In Guf Nefesh Abahamis and Noch Niderika, how the neshama gets stuck within the human body and contained by the Nefesh Abahamis, and then of course all the other difficult and more lowly elements of life that the neshama is exposed to. As these bonuses in Hazah Oifen, when a person gives such a thorough consideration to the state of their neshama, in alle 10 bechinos, all the 10 components, which are implied by the 10 names of the 10 sons of Binyamin, then the person is suddenly aroused and awakened, then suddenly the person can't control themselves anymore. They can't accept it anymore. They can't tolerate the negativity anymore. And this groundswell of emotion suddenly explodes, and they feel this bitterness. How could I be in this place? When a person is in such a broken state over their own spiritual descent, that awakens from Hashem this tremendous compassion. The greatness of rachamim, mercy, over chesed, kindness, is how warm it is, how heated it is, how infused it is. As we see in our own experience as humans. The nature of kindness is to be kind because it's good to be kind, because that's my nature to be kind. Yet the metaphor we use to describe chesed is water, which is naturally cool, not excited. Dagegen Gevura is in von Chamimus und Rishpeish, der Fire kommt von dem Kas und Reges Chulei. On the other extreme, we've got the element of Gevura, which is fiery, and that's why it could, if misguided, it could lead to tremendous anger. Midas Rachmanus aber Chotchas Irinin is Tov Chesed. Rachmanus, compassion, empathy. Yes, it is primarily about sharing goodness. But it is goodness with the fiery nature of Gevura. That's why we always talk about Tiferes being the composite of both Chesed and Gevura elements that come to produce something brand new and much more powerful. What is the concept of Rachamim? You see the pain that somebody else is in, you empathize. That awakens you with your own enthusiasm. And suddenly the person feels this incredible empathy and compassion for the other person. Which causes the person to share goodness and kindness with the victim, the recipient, the needy one, with enthusiasm. With a much greater push and yearning than chesed could produce on its own. The far is rachamim amamutza tzvishon chesed and gevura. Vale is kedel beida. That's why we always talk about rachamim as being the intermediary between chesed and gevura, because it harmonizes and brings together both elements. Und die seires rachamim und die pula was tut sich auf durch dem is merumas in commercial zeisim. The impact of rachamim is actually alluded to, believe it or not, in the Mishnah that describes this container with the pressed olives inside it. What are we describing? We already said before. Basically, you create a system whereby the olives get warm from the compressed space that they're in, and that allows the oil to come out. What does that mean in avoida? Zeisim zainin morim. As we well know, olives are bitter. But which they represent the bitterness a person feels about their own spiritual state, about their own soul. The reason a person would feel so bitter is because they actually considered their spiritual state. And when a person has this to the extreme, this compressed, this intensity of this merirus, that means when the person really feels it, it's not like an intellectual exercise. You actually feel the concept of this is ra umarloi, that it's bitter and bad to be distant from the Eibishter. And therefore the person awakens and arouses compassion from the Eibishter for his own neshama, and of course within himself for his own neshama. That's a crushing the olive, so the good stuff comes out. That elicits from Hashem the so-called supernal oil, which represents Hashem's infinite wisdom and Hashem's infinite mercy. And that infinite wisdom and mercy allows the person to experience Giloy Elikus inside himself. Das heißt, es wird Giloy Rabbi by mentioning in the Midah Shebelev, was das nimmt in Michma Bistra. And that means that the person actually, in full human emotional terms, feels this incredible love towards Hashem. So you go from Kumar Zaysim, which represents the process, to Michma Bisra, boiling up the basa, the gashmis of the person to actually feel enthusiastic for God. Then the next level is, so that's what Rashi tells us, right? First, the Kumar Zaysim. Then he tells us Michma Bisra. And what's the last thing he tells us? Skin. Eventually, that filters right out to the skin, the outer layers, the garments of the person. Das heißt, even the elements of a person which are far from the essence of who he truly is from his neshama perspective, they also come to life, and they're also now enthusiastic. It means the way we behave, the way we talk, even the way we think. And because all of this is powered by compassion, by rachamim, the rachamim is the middle ground, the central channel of divine energy. That's able to transform and totally switch the hunger, the feeling of distance, the feeling of being incapable, of being insufficient. Turns around, to, as the Navi describes it, that it will be loirav lo lechem, as Amos says, not a hunger for bread, not a thirst for water, but a thirst for the Eibush himself. Mitzvah Hashem, we should all be zeicher to that, and to have that hunger and thirst as it will be in the time of Mashiach now.